Welcome to Chit Chatter with Ria, the podcast that provides information to you about the legal and political process. Now here's your host, Ria Chattergoon.
Welcome back to Chit Chatter, guys. Well, the last episode I said it was a December to remember, and clearly I'm a little bit psychic because it is really turning out to be one. So much has happened in the last week since I've recorded. Senator Warnock won his race in Georgia in the runoff. Congratulations, Georgia. It was a crazy election, though. I'm surprised he didn't get up there and say, well, geez, thanks, guys, for coming to your senses. But he's a lot more gracious than I would ever be. 1.7 million people voted for Herschel Walker in Georgia. It's not surprising. It was only a 2-point lead. And, everyone seems to be a little bit shocked, myself included. But what we've got to realize is this snowball effect has sort of taken effect since Trump got elected, right? We keep asking ourselves, where are these crazy candidates coming from? But that's kind of where it started, and that's where it's snowballing. So Kristen Sinema announced today, as I'm recording this, that she is switching her party to be an independent and no longer affiliated with the Democratic Party. She said she's not truly a Democrat. No shit, Sherlock. She is just so freaking useless, and she's so selfish. This is a woman who started off with the quote unquote Green Party. She became a Democrat so that she could run and get votes for being a Democrat. And in her time in the Senate has shown some tendencies and really just held up the Democratic agenda. When I say show some tendencies to vote in favor of Republicans. And now she is switching to independent, which interferes with, of course, the Democratic majority. We still have the majority. When I say we, the Democrats have the majority in the Senate, but, now it's... She's just so useless, and I wish she would just go away. She's doing this to save her political career because the Democratic Party has really come down hard on her, and I think Democrats in Arizona are looking at her very, very closely. So, we'll see what happens with her. The Respect for Marriage Act passed the House, and it's on its way to President Biden's desk to be signed. It was expected. A lot of Republicans said they would think about switching their votes if there were certain protections for religious institutions included in the bill. And there were. We saw Rep. Vicky Hartzler from Missouri broke down in tears on the House floor. She brought out her white woman tears. And I'm going to do an entire episode on white woman tears because I think it's dangerous, and I think we're seeing it more and more. And I want to give you my perspective on how it affects different industries and citizens in this country. So yeah, she broke down and cried. There's a saying, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And watching her make her speech and cry about it just really, really embodies that saying. Rep. Glenn Thompson from Pennsylvania also voted no. What was interesting about him is he has a son who's gay. He attended his son's wedding. He talked about possibly switching his vote. He was one of those. And he said he didn't vote because it lacked appropriate protections for religious liberties. But he didn't say what they were. And so remember, there were some give and take with religious institutions in the final bill. I talk about that in the last episode. But he says it wasn't enough. But yet he doesn't expand on what he thinks it should be. And I also want to point out, I didn't in the last episode, that these religious institutions are getting a pass, right? They're getting these protections and still getting federal funding. So they're actually being allowed. So for example, if you have a religious university that doesn't believe in gay marriage or doesn't believe in protecting LGBTQ, the LGBTQ community, and don't want them in their schools, they can make that choice, right? And they're still getting federal funding. So, all of this is just really trying to pander to the people who sent them to the House. And I guess, listen, everybody deserves representation. And so we're always going to have this. But as of today, the Respect for Marriage Act has passed. President Biden's going to sign it. And we congratulate the LGBTQ community on that. In other news, Brittney Griner is home. She was finally released, as I'm recording this, yesterday. She was exchanged for Victor Boot, who is a notorious arms dealer. He's nicknamed the Merchant of Death. He's made some very, very scary and I would say just scary statements on Americans and what he would do if he was released. So I'm really surprised he was released. Listen, I'm glad Brittney Griner is home. I'm glad an American has been freed. I'm disappointed that the deal did not include Paul Whelan. Paul Whelan is a Marine who was accused of espionage. He was a businessman at the time. He's a former Marine, but he's been in prison since 2018. And so, there's a lot of backlash for the Biden administration on bringing Brittney Griner home and for making the deal that they did. And I don't know the details that went into the deal. Clearly, that's above my pay grade. I never understand how these exchanges are made, what kind of goes on behind closed doors, because you really don't get a front seat view into that. A lot of people, specifically MAGA Republicans, are mad, making just racist statements about bringing Brittney home. It's claiming, the Democrats want to increase their DEI quota. I think Donald Trump Jr., that worthless piece of what, said that this morning. And listen, I am of the unpopular opinion that when you go to someone else's country, you obey their rules. And she broke the rules, right? She broke the law, and she had a small amount of liquid hashish in her bag. It was illegal in Russia. Yes, it was illegal, and yes, Russia used that to their advantage to really throw the book at her, and they did. They charged her with the highest offense they could. They then sentenced her to 9 years. They then sent her to a labor camp that was, said to have slave conditions. So yes, they treated her harshly, and it was wrong. And I'm happy she's home. I do wish Paul Whelan came home as well. And it's, you can both things can be true, right? You can be happy that Brittney Griner is home, and you can be disappointed that Paul Whelan isn't. And they're different negotiations and discussions that happen into why. What I don't like is the racism that has come out of it. And it's so blatant, right? And the same MAGA Republicans who are making these awful statements, and not just MAGA Republicans, there are some Democrats, there are some Black people making the comments that she shouldn't have come home, which, look, I'm not a Brittney Griner fan. I don't forget her past. I don't forget her domestic abuse. I don't forget how she denied her children that were in NICU. I mean, she's not the most stand-up citizen, but at the end of the day, she is an American citizen, and we have to protect our people. And she came home, and I'm happy for that. I'm happy she's home before the holidays. No trade is perfect. No trade is perfect. You're trading one criminal for another. At the end of the day, that's what it is. But I don't like the sort of racist comments that have come out of it. Like I said, I wish Paul Whelan came home, but Russia is really holding on to the fact that they believe he was a spy, and so they're unwilling to release him. I do want to point out to all of the people making these disgusting comments surrounding this situation that, especially the Trump supporters and those MAGA Republicans, you guys realize Trump didn't do anything to help Paul Whelan, never even negotiated. He released, however, 5,000 Taliban criminals. But, we can get into that long discussion of why he didn't. part of which I believe is he just really didn't care, but no one blamed him for that. And now everyone wants to turn the tides to President Biden, and because he is the president at the moment. But let's not forget, President Biden got Trevor Reed released in April of this year. Trevor Reed was another former Marine who was arrested, charged, and convicted of alleged espionage, I believe it was as well. And he was sentenced to about 9 years, I believe. And so President Biden got him out in April in exchange for, don't ask me to say this guy's name, it was a Russian smuggler who allegedly he was convicted of importing cocaine and was sentenced to 20 years in 2011. Not sure why Russia chose that guy for that prisoner exchange. Again, above my pay grade. And there's so many things that go into these prisoner exchanges, but that was done in April. No one talked about it. No one cared that Trevor Reed came home, right? And so, I want us to just really take a moment, celebrate that an American came home. Yes, I have my own feelings that the type of exchange that we made with Victor Boot, being the quote unquote merchant of death is, it may have been an unfair exchange, but at the end of the day, we've got to celebrate an American coming home and being saved from just excruciating circumstances. They're still in talks to get Paul Whelan at home, and we're just going to pray that there's a plan in place. I'm sure there is. You can say what you want about the Biden administration, but they have had a lot of success in the last 2 years, and this is just one of them. What else is going on? Trevor Noah said goodbye. Trevor Noah from The Daily Show. I love Trevor Noah. I love The Daily Show. I am a huge fan of Jon Stewart. Listen to his podcast all the time. But Trevor said goodbye, and he's going on a tour. I've actually seen him on tour before, and he was great. He's great at stand-up. So we wish him the best. We're definitely going to miss him. Maybe I'll get to bed earlier now that he's gone. Today's episode is really about the consequences of the Dobbs decision. Dobbs, again, is the decision that came down in June that reversed Roe versus Wade. And after I launched that episode, I got a lot of questions about, well, how does this affect IVF? How does it affect, adoption, all of these things, right? And so I said, well, maybe I should do an episode of how the end of Roe v. Wade impacts IVF, fertility treatments, genetic screenings. That is not my area of the law. So I do have a friend today, Sherry Fox, who she is an attorney in the Virginia, Maryland area, and her firm, Fox Family Formation, helps individuals and families navigate the legal process surrounding surrogacy, genetic material donation, and adoption. And so I thought she would be the best person to talk about how Roe v. Wade affects this area and this area of law, because the truth is a lot of families turn to surrogacy or, genetic material donation, which means egg donations, sperm donations, and adoption to start their families. I have a lot of friends who have been through IVF. I've got a lot of friends who are in the process of freezing their eggs. And it's a very, very emotional place to be, but there's a lot of legal aspects that go into it. And so when Roe v. Wade was overturned in June by the Dobbs decision, a lot of families and individuals found their right to choose when to have their children in jeopardy. And now, listen, Dobbs didn't specifically say how the decision was going to impact IVF, fertility treatments, etc. But what came out of it was, when does life or personhood actually begin? And so these personhood laws sort of developed, and so there were just, what we're seeing are blanket statements, extreme laws that people who have to use fertilized embryos in order to have a child, could be forced to expand their families if whether they have the means or desire to do so. And so there's a lot surrounding fertility treatments as we go, and the law hasn't really been clear on what that is. And so Sherry's better off to talk to us about that. She is a joy. If you're in the Virginia, Maryland area, even DC, you can reach out to Sherry if you are looking for someone, specifically a lawyer, to assist you with the legal process. I hope you enjoy this interview, and as always, like and subscribe. Welcome to the show, Sherry Fox. How are you, Sherry?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Thank you for coming on. And you do your own little podcast as well, right?
I don't, but let's manifest that because I'd like to.
I thought you did. Really?
I was on someone else's podcast.
That's what it was. That's what I saw. Okay. Yeah, that's why I think I got a little jealous and reached out to you to come on to mine. All right. Sherry, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Sherry Fox. I am an attorney. I practice in Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and my law firm is Fox Family Formation. So what I do is I assist individuals and couples who wish to family build through surrogacy, gamete donation, and adoption. And
what donation?
Gamete. So
tell us what that is.
Egg donation, sperm donation, embryo donation.
Okay. Yeah. And I always like to ask, because even though I may know what the terms are, people who are not in that world just really have no idea what that is. But that's an interesting sector of the law to be in. How'd you get into that?
So I am a recovering litigator. I spent 15 years practicing litigation. I did a fair amount of federal litigation, state litigation. I won't bore you. It was fighting people. Like, let's just sum it up that way.
I get it.
Yeah. I know.
I get it.
And then about 8 years ago, just out of intellectual curiosity, I was learning about things like CRISPR, which CRISPR is a gene editing tool. And there have been articles about like designer babies and ways to grow meat without cows. And I'm a little bit of a nerd. So I was reading this stuff and I was like, this is cool. And I learned that, there were attorneys practicing in the area of assisted reproductive technology, because I learned that was part of the sort of precursor to getting your medical clearance. And I did not know that. So I went to a conference and started talking to people, and I was like, so people do this and you make a living, like you don't eat ramen.
Right. There's nothing worse than being the broke lawyer. Right.
Seriously. So I was like, is this a real thing? So I found out it was, came back, started that practice at my former firm, and then fast forward. Yes, I did it there for about 7 years at my former firm. And it was myself and a colleague where we were the practice group. And then last August, I left and started my own firm so I could just leave the litigation behind. It was good for what it was. I enjoyed my clients, but it was time to just focus on this area of law that really brings me a lot of satisfaction and joy. So here I am.
Well, and surrogacy and IVF has just, I don't know if it's just the awareness of it has increased in the past few years, but it seems to have increased the number of people using surrogates, the number of people undergoing IVF. It could be just a matter of my age and having, friends who have both successfully and unsuccessfully gone through IVF. We do have a couple of miracle babies in my little girlfriend group through IVF, some twins. But I also have some friends who have just had their heart broken and been through IVF, a few times for it not to work. But I have seen the increase in surrogacy. I think we're seeing it sort of with more celebrities because it's just coming out, and sort of having that designer baby where they're doing gender selection and
yeah,
a little creepy to me,
a
but
little, yes, a lot,
but
maybe a
listen,
lot creepy.
right. But I'm pro-choice, and that means,
Yes.
you get to choose what you get to choose for your life. And so talk to me a little bit now. Well, let me ask you this. We obviously know the Dobbs decision. You and I had a little bit of conversation about around the time that the decision came out, just about how ridiculous this is, that we are being
Yes.
treated as second-class citizens and we don't even have a say-so over our own healthcare.
Yes.
After the episode I did about abortion and about Dobbs, I was DM'd a lot, and I got a lot of text messages from personal friends about, well, how is this going to affect surrogacy and IVF? And I said, I haven't really thought about it. I haven't really looked into it. And then I kept getting messages about it, and I kept sort of reading into it. And I was like, wait a minute, I know the perfect person to ask this. So what are your thoughts on how Dobbs is going to affect, or has it affected, surrogacy and IVF thus far?
Absolutely. So I will tell you, there are a couple impacts that I've experienced thus far. There are some that I think are also on the horizon. So I'll start with just sort of the practical changes for me in practicing in this area. So I have found that the Dobbs decision has, first of all, changed the way that I draft contracts for clients who are entering into surrogacy arrangements and donor arrangements. Because we used to have language in there that says every woman has a constitutional right to, abort. We no longer have that in there. We do talk about legal autonomy, like personal autonomy. We talk about that a great deal, but we also now talk about so let me back up, intended parents. Typically, there's intended parents and there's a gestational carrier or surrogate. And I use those terms interchangeably.
Okay.
Typically, in Virginia, I'll talk about a gestational carrier is the person who makes all the clinical pregnancy management decisions. However, by entering into this contract, she's saying, I understand this is not my genetic child, that I'm carrying this child for you, intended parents. And so I'm going to honor your wishes, and I'm going to honor the terms of this contract, including allowing for termination or selective reduction, should it be necessary,
Really?
right?
Okay.
So what happens now post Dobbs? Post Dobbs, one, she no longer has a legal constitutional right given to her by the federal Constitution. And two, we have to be concerned with what if laws change and her agreeing to terminate or selectively reduce will result in civil liability or criminal prosecution of her, right? For honoring contract terms. So we now put that in our contracts. At least I do. I now have language in my contracts that identify the fact that as long as it's legally permissible for her to undertake a termination, she will do so. All parties will work together collaboratively to ensure that she is not unduly exposed to liability. I mean, these are not things we had to think about before. And I would like to illustrate that too with a story you and I, off the mic we're talking about. So, this has real world implications for my clients. So I have clients that had a carrier here in Virginia. My clients live elsewhere. And they had a situation, unfortunately, arise where it was determined that their fetus, that was about 24 weeks gestation, had somewhere around there, had significant fetal reduction, a restriction rather, in utero. So we're talking less than 1% growth. So it was a dire situation for them, as you might imagine. They desperately want this child, which is another irony of what's going on here. Okay, which we can talk about, but desperately want this child, and started panicking about, well, what are our options? What should we do now? It's typical to then go to a specialist and find out, like, what does the specialist say? Is this something that's going to resolve itself? Are there things we should be doing now to treat it? Like, what should we do? they were kind of in the midst of that decision-making process. They were also trying to think about, well, if we have to terminate, we need to think about timing, because remember, we were somewhere around like 24, 25, 26 weeks. In Virginia, we have our own cap on that. I believe it's 29. So you have to think about, well, DC is next door. So some of this was just planning, not so much that's definitely what we're going to do, but we might need to make an appointment now.
Because you need to make quick decisions. Right.
Correct. So some of this was sort of like prophylactic. They were just like, okay, maybe we need to make an appointment, and maybe we won't ever use that appointment, but we need to make it. Well, lo and behold, this carrier who they had been having perfectly great communication with, frankly, better than good communication, great communication with, went dark. Stopped talking to them, stopped responding to texts, didn't respond to emails, no phone calls, just nothing. Wow. Remember, she's carrying their child. Right?
Right. Let's back up for a second. A surrogate, right? People use surrogates for various reasons, right? It's not always just a choice. It could be the couple, the woman can't carry the child, but she's able to produce an egg, and that embryo is able to be fertilized, etc. So you're trusting someone, whether it be with your eggs, with a donor egg, whatever choice you make, you're trusting that person to carry your child. And it's a contractual relationship, which is where the attorneys come in. And it has very emotional and financial implications, right? Because the surrogate isn't doing it for free. And so this surrogate goes silent.
Goes dark, right? She goes silent, and she bears no genetic connection to this child. So my clients are trying to figure out what's going on. It turns out they receive a letter from a Right to Life attorney outfit in another area that says, you will not force her to terminate. You cannot force her to terminate. We're here to let you know that all communications need to come through us. So they initially weren't my clients. They happened to get referred to me once it got to that point, because a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, knew of my litigation background, and she's like, you got to deal with these people. Right. You know, this has become a situation that's potentially litigious. And so anyway, we ended up exchanging letters. I mean, I can't believe I was sending demand letters in a surrogacy arrangement, but I was, you know, and negotiating things. And ultimately,
what does that demand letter look like, though? Because what are you asking for?
Well, in my case, my demand letter was in part demand letter, in part response to their letter. I was reminding them of the contract terms and saying, you know, because realistically, Ria, I don't think that there is a court that is prepared to force her to terminate.
Okay? Right.
My clients didn't want to force her to terminate. I want to make that clear too. Like that's
they hadn't even made a decision yet.
They hadn't even made a decision yet. But we still had a contract. And so we still have, you know, what we call specific performance, like honor what you said you're going to do in this contract. And so my letter was like, hey, don't forget that in this contract, it says she's going to communicate with my clients. Don't forget that she's not carrying a baby that's hers genetically. Don't forget that she has relinquished any rights to this child that she's carrying. And intends and says that she is going to sign anything she needs to sign to relinquish those rights. So let's not forget that, you know, this is not her child. And I was, you know, I was fully prepared to find my face on the cover of some newspaper as like the baby killing lawyer. Like, I don't know where this is about to go. I mean, this law firm, I had never heard of them. Well, that's not true. I had heard of them, but I had never dealt with them. And so, you know, the good news is we were able to sort of traverse this, negotiate it, and get back to a place where there was going to be communication. And I will tell you that all's well that ends well, in that once she did get to a specialist, we were able to address the problem, baby was born and by all accounts is healthy now.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, that also illustrates the point of there was this lack of communication, and we may have never even gotten to a termination if she had just talked to them back then.
Right.
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 But this is sort of like a cautionary tale now, because, you know, it's not atypical for you to have a carrier that, you know, doesn't necessarily live in your same state or your same city.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, you're trusting this person
with your child.
So yeah.
So how does that, so wait, before I get to that, let me ask you this. Do you think part of the surrogates, and I don't know if you've had conversations with the other attorney, but part of the surrogates issue was fear of liability, either criminal or civil, because of what's been happening with abortion laws, you know, both federally and in the states?
I don't know that to be true.
Okay.
I will tell you, it wasn't raised with me. And so I think that if that was an issue, I would have imagined it would have been raised.
Mm-hmm.
Anecdotally, I learned that there was someone in her community, perhaps like a pastor or someone, who approached her when it slipped out somehow information that she was considering a termination, and that she was in some form shamed into feeling like, you know, she was going to potentially be doing something wrong. But I can't say, I mean, she may have been thinking that. No one brought it up with me. I'll just say that. In the letters we exchanged, no one said, you know, she's afraid that she's going to be exposed to criminal or civil liability.
And I raise that because, you know, some states are putting forth bills that are making abortion not only for the mother, but for the doctor and the facilities, imposing
and the lawyer
and the lawyer
and the lawyer. Oh, let's remember.
Right.
Yeah.
So you know, that I see is an issue that's going to have to be handled. But you brought up an interesting point when you said the pastor may have intervened. And I've been thinking about this because from a religious aspect, you know, we know that, well, one, they don't talk about abortion in the Bible, but we won't get into that. But as far as other religions, so I have a lot of Jewish friends. I have family who are Hindu and Muslim. And so, you know, the health of the mother in those religions is first and foremost, right? And so you have a lot of Jewish organizations who are filing lawsuits saying you're now impinging on our religious freedom if you're going to put in these abortion bans. And so I suspect that would play into surrogacy and, you know, IVF, especially if you're housing and embryos, because you don't know which, I mean, that you could talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because personhood and these bans are going to directly impact the ability of people to make choices around what to do with embryos that they've created.
Tell us what personhood law or personhood.
So essentially, what we're talking about when we talk about personhood bills and abortion bans, you know, generally speaking, that we've been touching on post Dobbs, are really aimed at creating a circumstance where a fetus is treated as a fully fledged person, right? A person with rights, etc. We can debate the 14th Amendment and what it says about when you become a person. We don't have to go there right now. Right. I'll just say it doesn't say that it's when you're a fetus with a heartbeat.
Right.
You know, so personhood, the issues around personhood implicate decision making for people facing infertility, because they're wondering, well, okay, it's typical to, you know, if you can retrieve multiple eggs, if you can, to go ahead, fertilize them, create embryos, and then test them. Right. And so the questions arise, okay, if they test and it is not an embryo that would be appropriate for transfer because it has a significant abnormality, can we destroy it?
That? Right.
Can we, and
what is that considered an abortion?
Is that, yeah, or is it considered murder?
Murder, because you're now with these personhood laws, right? You're giving that embryo the rights of a person.
In Louisiana, an embryo is a jurisdictional person. It's a person. So you can't,
A person who can't consent.
Yeah, you can't destroy it.
Right.
I should say. And so it's that, right? So what does that mean? So let's set aside the embryo part. Let's set aside that. Let's just talk about the treatment then, if that's the case with embryos. So do we now relegate people who are trying to build their families to different, less effective methods of moving forward? Should they be treated like they're not worthy of getting the very best options for family building? Right. It has far-reaching implications, I think. And again, like what I mentioned earlier, the irony is these are people who desperately want a child. These are not people who are like, oh yeah, like, because I think we have this really tired trope of the like woman who had a one-night stand and like is responsible, and like that's what we're,
that accounts for maybe 1% of abortions.
And it's just, and so I look at my clients who are like, that would be a nightmare to terminate a pregnancy. It's not at all that we want to do that.
Right.
But, we're just trying to figure out, what do we do now? And they're thinking a lot about their embryos, and they're thinking a lot about, where do I store them? Because if you're storing them in a state that the laws are changing,
right,
you might need to transfer them before that change happens. Will you be able to transfer them?
And then what happens to the remainder? So I was actually reading an article about this couple who chose to store their embryos in Canada, which is a significant financial obligation, right? Yes. Because, so I know when my friends were going through IVF, it was anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000, right? I mean, that's just depending on the number of rounds, depending on the treatment you need, etc. What does surrogacy run on an average?
So it does vary. I would say that, I'll tell you that starting for a first-time carrier, you're probably looking at reimbursement of around $45,000.
Wow.
And that's just base allowance. That's before you start talking about other reimbursements, because we do allow reimbursements for other things like, bed rest or invasive procedures and what have you. But it's pretty typical right now that you're looking somewhere around $45,000 for base allowance. Significant amount of money.
What are storage fees for embryos? Do you know what that is? A lot. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think it varies as well. I don't think you're far off base with that, because I do think there are certain factors that go into that. But no, it's a significant sum. We're not talking like $500, which is still can be a significant sum for people. But I'm saying we're talking about thousands of dollars.
Right, because you're storing viable embryos, meaning they can be implanted into someone. And so, for people who haven't been through IVF, when you retrieve eggs and if you fertilize those eggs and after you test them, depending on the number of eggs you receive and how many are fertilized, I mean, I've had friends who've had 9, viable embryos.
Yes.
They're not all implanted, right? They kind of save them. But the question is, well, what do we do? I have a friend who has embryos stored, and she and her husband are planning on having one more, but she's like, well, what do I do with the rest of them? Because she's also Catholic, right? So it's sort of that Catholic guilt of, am I killing these babies? But what do you do with them? And to me, post Dobbs, it seems like that choice may be taken away from the parent, or the, I should say, owners of the embryos at that point, right? So what do you what are your thoughts on how that's going to develop?
I think that we are going to see restrictions eventually. I don't see a world where we're not going to, because I think that the goal of personhood bills is to directly impact, of course, abortion, but I think it will necessarily impact assisted reproductive technology. And so, I don't see a world where we continue on this trajectory and it doesn't reach that. And I can tell you, practitioners in my field are worried about it. We are constantly talking about it. We just talked about it at our last conference. We touched upon it. We have a brown bag coming up. I help with planning with the American Bar Association for our section. We have a whole day dedicated to it coming up next spring. I mean, we are worried about it, and our clients are worried about it. My clients have been worried about it. My same-sex clients have been worried as well.
I was about to ask you about same-sex couples, because those couples are usually the ones either dealing with surrogacy or IVF. And then even if they're doing IVF and one is the gestational carrier, if the other one isn't genetically linked to the baby, I mean, you've got all kinds of issues there.
And so with those clients, right, what I'm doing is I'm assisting them with the surrogacy portion. And then I'm assisting them with the parentage. So establishing their parental rights, because of exactly what you just said. They don't both share genetics. Well, as you know, we've all heard about what Justice Thomas said as part of the decision. We all know that there's a real concern around the impact that is going to be felt on same-sex marriage. Thankfully, there have been some heartening developments since that time. I mean, we all know that just recently
passed the bill.
We passed the bill, but
but that still leaves marriage up to the states, though. So that's gonna have lasting impact. I mean, there's gonna be lawsuits that happen in the next few years, and if we still have this Supreme Court, I mean, we may end up in the same position that we're in now, right? And in the meantime, these same-sex couples who are trying to have a family are going to be affected. I mean, contractually, that has to be, I'm just thinking, putting my lawyer brain on, that's a nightmare to have to deal with if I'm in Florida specifically, right? I know you're in Virginia, Maryland, and DC, but in Florida, and ironically, so one of my law review paper in law school, because I am a nerd, I'm sorry, was about adoption by same-sex couples in Florida. And, I see some of that was 18, 19 years ago. I'm still seeing those issues now. And it's just crazy to me that this area hasn't progressed, really.
Yeah. And it's a significant problem. And, it's something that I routinely address with my clients because they are worried about their parental rights. We do have circumstances where, I had a case with a client that had a child before there was marriage equality, subsequently got married, didn't do a second parent or confirmatory adoption, right? Then got divorced. The next thing you know, her ex-wife wanted to have her new wife adopt their child and did not give my client notice because she was not on the birth certificate. So then we're fighting. I mean, these are people's lives too. Like, let's not I think too, that when people sort of who are not either interested in it, like you and I are, right? And see this as something that's just like kind of over here in the left field, like not really impacting, touching their lives. They think it's just this thing that happens in these places that they don't know of, right? Like they can't. But I'm saying, like, I know people, clients, friends, who are experiencing this. So it is not this amorphous thing. Like, these are real people who are really facing challenges as a result of this. And so, it is a very difficult landscape, and it feels like it's only going to become more difficult.
Right. So I'm trying to anticipate questions I'm going to get after this airs. And I can see the question being, well, if some abnormality occurs with the fetus and the genetic parents want to terminate pregnancy, the surrogate doesn't, is that something that's contractually decided between the parties beforehand?
It is typically part of the contract, yes.
Okay.
So our contracts typically explain expressly what circumstances would cause the surrogate to move forward with a termination. And so it will usually say, significant abnormalities that are not, that do not lend themselves to like a meaningful life, or even tighter language than that. It kind of depends on the parties, and they do talk about those things. Generally, they have an opportunity to have counseling beforehand. Most fertility clinics require that and say you need to like really hash out these things. And of course, they always want clearance to make sure that the parties are all mentally fit to move forward with this kind of arrangement anyway, but they do address it. And so, yes, we do address that in the contract. And so we will say, here are the terms. And I've had parties that have come together and say, we don't want to terminate under any circumstances. And they were all in agreement.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, great. Well, then if we're all in agreement, that's what we'll put in the contract. If that's what.
But then what happens if I agree to that? We're contract, the contract says what it says, but my state just changed its law and now it's illegal to have an abortion after 20 weeks after, here in Florida, it's 15, some random number they came up with because it makes no scientific sense.
15 has no like tie to any.
Nothing. It's Florida. Like, what can I say? But, then am I violating the contract because legally I can't, right? So
we end up putting provisions in there about traveling if you can. And that's where we talk about, traveling as long as that won't open you up to liability. So it might mean you going to another state if possible. And if it doesn't pose a threat to your life too, is the other thing, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's
quite an interesting area of law. I will say that, just the nerd in me saying that, but Sherry, thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of questions. Can you tell people where to find you and how to find you?
Absolutely. So I'm on the social media. I'm on the social media. I am on Instagram at Fox_family_formation. So Fox Family Formation, you'll find me on there. And I'm on TikTok, much to the chagrin of my children. Also at Fox Family Formation.
Awesome. And your firm is Fox Family Formation, and you're in Virginia, Maryland, and DC, correct?
That's correct. And you can find my website.
Awesome.
Fox Family Formation. Yep.
Well, Sherry, thank you so much. Thank you. We may have you back on depending on the progression of these laws.
Back on. This was a pleasure. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
All right. Thanks, Sherry.
All right.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend wherever you get your podcasts and tell a friend. You can also follow the podcast on our social media pages.